All right, good morning, everyone. Great to have you all here. My name is Sumanth. Our session today is going to be about next generation security for the next generation Internet of Devices. So we're going to be talking about using a case study, a wearable device that sits on your head. It's a fitness coach. We'll talk about how to do security for that class of devices, not just that particular device, but essentially wearables and IoT devices that are new somewhat to the market and that are posing challenges in how to do security. So we'll be speaking about how the traditional security development lifecycle, the SDL practices, the best practices, don't necessarily apply or cannot be directly mapped if you want to secure the IoT and the wearable devices of the future. We have some cool examples of bugs and weaknesses that we found through our research team when we're working on these classes of products. We're not going to be disclosing any new vulnerabilities today. It's not about that. It's about how to do SDL for the future-looking products. So stay tuned. So who are we?
Hello, everyone. I'm Kavya. I'm the head of security for Intel at their sports division. And as part of my job at Intel, I'm responsible for the security and privacy of a variety of VR and AR kind of devices. And also, I've worked in the past on a bunch of wearable and IoT devices.
Thanks. And I'm Sumanth. I'm the founder and CEO of a security consulting firm called Deep Armor, where we provide security consulting, SDL, vulnerability assessment, and penetration testing services. I've been in the industry for a while, worked in a variety of security leadership and technical roles at Intel, for Palm, and Sun Microsystems. All right, so are there problems in the new devices? Yes, there are. So we'll be speaking about what kind of issues we see in the IoT and wearable kind of products, and what is our proposal for addressing them, both from a process point of view as well as a technical point of view. Quick agenda. So we'll be giving an introduction about an in-ear fitness coach. This is just a case study. We'll be using this as an example of what an IoT product looks like. We'll talk about the traditional security development lifecycle methods, what has been around for several years now, and why it does not really apply directly when we are talking about doing the same for IoT and wearables. For illustrating our example, we'll use the software fitness coach. What are the paradigms when it comes to the hardware, the firmware, and the software side of things? How do we do ingredient level security? How do we do security when all these things come together as an ecosystem? Why a wearable device is just not what you see that's sitting on your wrist or on your head. So we'll be talking about the ecosystem security. In addition to that, Kavya will walk you through a bunch of weaknesses and demos on what problems plague these class of devices. And no presentation about wearables is complete without talking about privacy. So what are the privacy problems that we see when it comes to wearables and IoT devices? What are the questions that the vendors and manufacturers need to ask? What are the regulations? What are the policies they need to conform to when they are shipping and selling an IoT device? Generally speaking, if you look at any device manufacturer, a product manufacturer that is making an IoT device or a wearable, they work off a generic blueprint that looks somewhat like this. So broadly, if you look at the screen at the bottom left, you have the form factor devices. So you have the gateway and the node devices. On the right-hand side, you see the companion phone application, which is typically an app on your Android or an iOS phone. And then you have a cloud component. So on the device side, you have the gateway, which is a piece of hardware. Relative to the nodes, it has a much richer stack of software and a little more battery and performance abilities. And the function of the gateway is to act as an intermediary between the nodes and the cloud backend and or the mobile phone applications. So the nodes do all the hard work. They have the sensors, they collect ambient information, they collect data. They push them up to the gateway, and the gateway processes it, sends them back to the cloud or to the mobile phone. The mobile phone is often used as a provisioning mechanism where you bring the device out of your box, you make it usable, you personalize the device. So that's what the mobile phone is used for. It is also used for collecting information and pushing it back to the back end, the cloud, where you often have a rich set of APIs and web portals where you can manage your information. You can see data, you can see graphs, what your performance is over a period of weeks, months, and years. So the backend has all the software that processes your data. There's a whole lot of communication, as you can see in the picture. You could have the gateway communicate with the cloud and the device, well, and the mobile app. You can have the nodes themselves directly communicate to the mobile app, as in case of wearables, or they may communicate directly with the backend, as in case of smartwatches. And the mobile apps communicate with the cloud over HTTP, HTTPS. So all the communication points here you see, they are sensitive when it comes to security. So every single component that you see on this picture needs to have security built in, developed, and integrated. All right, on to our case study. So we have an in-ear fitness coach. This is a head-worn wearable device that has inputs that go into your ear. And in this particular case, it's an example of a device that you can use for improving your athletic ability. If you want to run better, if you want to train better, to cycle more, for example. And this is a device that you purchase, you use over a period of months to get better at what you're doing. It's a wearable, so it needs to be comfortable. So the form factor needs to be small and usable on a regular basis. It needs to be smart because it needs to understand what you're speaking and give you appropriate responses. It needs to be untethered. That could mean two things. One is you do not want wires running all over your body. And when you're running or cycling, you do not want to carry your mobile phone with you. And it needs to be tailored to you, which means it has to have a continuous learning process where it understands what your workout scenarios look like, how it can make you better rather than make a generic population better. Everyone loves data. So you want to see charts, you want to see graphs, you want to see how you're doing over a period of weeks and months. So there needs to be the ability to handle the data, process it, and give you the information that you need. And by and large, you'd buy a wearable like this for better quality of life, to improve your personal life. How do you secure it? So first of all, you need to unlearn a few things. So as a security team that was doing the groundwork for developing this product securely out of the box, we needed to unlearn some of the traditional SPDL practices. So Microsoft has done a great job. So years ago, they pushed out the Security Development Lifecycle process. Very well thought of, very thorough. But some of these processes were made for programs that lasted for a long time, for months, for years. These are the kind of programs that existed for products whose requirements do not change, right? So you evolve, you develop a product right from the requirement stage, you come up with the design, you come up with the flows, you implement the product, then you push the product out, there are maintenance releases, it's a very smooth waterfall. But when you're looking at wearables, that's not how it is. So you're looking at wearables, products that are conceived today but need to hit the shelves like 6 months down the line, 8 months down the line. So very rapid time to market is the need for wearables and IoT. And at the same time, you have the requirements changing very rapidly. So we have had cases where we had products that had a bunch of requirements at the beginning, but once the code is complete, they changed, you go back, you jump back to the architecture stage, you rework the development cycle, you push out new code. And at each step of the development, the product life cycle, we need to do security. So rapidly evolving requirements, when you have a rapid time to market, that's a huge challenge. And the last time I checked about the communication protocols for IoT devices, I counted like 64. Maybe there are more. But the point is that there are so many protocols, so many standards, that there is not really a standard. Each vendor, each company can implement their own protocol for doing their own wireless sensor network, for their own communication mechanisms and so on. And it's not just that. Sometimes even if the spec is really good, let's say your product uses Bluetooth or BLE, the Bluetooth 4.2 spec and the 5 coming soon, they take into consideration security really well. But what about the adoption of the spec in all these pieces? Right? So you have the gateway, you have the nodes, you have the mobile phones that need to adopt Bluetooth. So are they understanding the spec correctly? Are they implementing the spec security correctly? One of the examples that we're going to show shows that that's not the case. We'll be speaking about an example where the spec itself is pretty solid. The platform security is pretty solid. But the way the spec has been adopted on the platform, there are some weaknesses there. And that can be pretty bad from an end user consequence point of view. And of course, when it comes to IoT, there can be a whole range of longevity. So like if I buy a smart fridge, for example, I don't want to ship it back if there is a security bug. If I buy a fridge, I want it to last for 8 to 12 years, right? So it needs to be, so if I'm selling a smart fridge, it needs to be very secure out of the field. And some of these products are difficult to update in the field. Privacy is a big deal. I have a separate section for privacy. And when it comes to security and IoT and doing the research, Black Hats, CanSec, some of these big conferences have some really interesting talks. They're coming up, but the research has been pretty nascent. So we are not seeing a lot of research, but we're making some really good progress. But I think this is where the future lies. On the technical front, we have seen a lot of challenges when it comes to managing and defining personally identifiable information and personal data. So wearables, IoT devices live in close proximity to humans, so which means they collect information regarding your geolocation, your biometrics, and if you use some of these for making payments, it could have access to your credit cards, what kind of purchases that you make over a period of time. So that's a lot of data. And because they are small, they have like kilobytes of flash memory sometimes, there is a very limited software stack, which means that in order to fit a security library, in order to do like Diffie-Hellman public key encryption, so that can be a challenge. That's when things get compromised. So, and these are often running microcontrollers, not full-blown SoCs or big stack of processors. And trusted execution environments take software stacks, almost impossible. And it's not just the device, right? So remember the picture that I showed. So there is a cloud component, there is a device component. The modern cloud, the AWS, the Microsoft Azure, the Google Cloud, these are all great, but there are new challenges when it comes to these kind of deployments. Like, for example, it is possible to have an AWS instance owned by a manufacturer supporting multiple clients. Just to pick absolutely random examples, you could have a wearable device manufacturer supporting both, let's say, Nike and Adidas. On the same virtual appliance in the back end, you could still have the same database holding information belonging to these two very different clients. So that's the multi-tenancy aspect. How do you define security when it comes to this? Does your security best practices make sure that a Nike user or a Nike admin does not get access to Adidas users? So these are some of the challenges that we've seen. So what do we propose? From a process point of view, we have a next generation SDL proposal. We do not want to reinvent the wheel. We love the traditional SDL process. We want to take as much as possible from that and make it more tailored for IoT and wearable devices and also include the modern cloud technologies. We want to make sure that we not only account for ingredient level security, but we also account for the ecosystem, how things operate, what security problems can occur when you're gelling the entire thing into a single ecosystem, what interoperability challenges exist, what kind of integration problems you can see. And we want our SDL to be agile. We want to jump from the penetration testing cycle back to the threat modeling, back to the attack trees. And because privacy and legal become a big deal when it comes to IoT and wearables, we wanted to see how we can tightly weave the privacy tasks and activities into the SDL process. And of course, we love OWASP, NEST, CVE, CWE, and so on. Some of our best practices include these industry standards, but at the same time make it more tuned towards IoT and wearable devices. And Kavya is going to talk about SPDL now.
So as part of this proposal for a next generation SDL, we introduce you to SPDL, which stands for Security and Privacy Development Lifecycle. Most of you might be familiar with the custom SDL, the traditional SDL that was introduced by Microsoft a few years ago. SPDL stands for, as I mentioned, it stands for Security and Privacy Development Lifecycle, where we weave privacy and also legal into each step of the security development lifecycle. And to start off with, it has the architecture reviews. SPDL consists of 5 critical milestones, and each milestone in turn has a specific set of activities. During the first phase of SPDL, all the security and privacy requirements are identified, and as part of the privacy review, all the privacy stakeholders, so the data collectors, data processors, data owners, everybody is identified, and you kickstart the privacy plan or the privacy review process. And a quick show of hands, if you are familiar with the nomenclature of alpha, beta, if you're using it for tracking your product development lifecycle. Okay, I'll just quickly walk through what it means. Alpha translates to code complete, and between alpha and beta is when all the bug fixes are rolled in, and beta is when the code is actually frozen. After the architecture reviews, the threat modeling and architecture reviews follow, where a specific set of security and privacy test cases are mapped out based on the architecture review, and which is followed by the review of the privacy plans and privacy notices, user license agreements. Then follows the penetration testing the penetration testing cycle, where all the test cases identified in the previous step are actually tested out on the product itself. And as part of this process, all the privacy notices are also signed off. After all this, there's a fair chance that the product might still be compromised once it gets released to the market. And that is why we need to have an incident response plan in place, and also a legal and privacy plan in place. So who are the necessary stakeholders that need to be identified in case of a data breach or in case of a vulnerability disclosure after the product gets released. And this is a loop. So based on the, if you have like a phased out release, you can actually take the learnings or the results from the previous version of the SPDL and then apply it for your next release. So to recap the wearable ecosystem that we took a look at earlier, we have three primary components or three critical components: the device, the mobile app or the companion phone, and also the cloud component. Now, it's not just sufficient to secure each one of these components, but it's also important that we secure the entire ecosystem itself. Let's dive into each one of these components. To start off with, we have the device, and it has three different components to it: the software component, the firmware, and also the hardware. I'm not going to dive into each one of these requirements here, and also the requirements we have here are the very minimal set of requirements you need to incorporate when designing the device aspect of the wearable ecosystem. I'm just going to pick a few ones. On the hardware side, we have port access restrictions. So what it means is locking down all the debug or data transfer interfaces. So all the USB, UART, JTAG interfaces need to be locked down, and you need to make sure that they only support charging. So all the ports, especially in production, they shouldn't allow any data transfer or debug access. And then we have data at rest encryption, which means most of these wearables, due to the nature of use cases they support and due to the requirement that they need to operate in the absence of your phone, they tend to store data locally until they sync with the companion mobile app and then transfer data back to the cloud. And most of this data is PII or sensitive information. And when it is stored locally on the wearable device, it needs to be secured. It needs to be encrypted. And on the software layer itself, I'm going to pick third-party libraries or any third-party applications that are intended to run on your device. So all the third-party components or third-party libraries, third-party applications need to be verified, and they need to be thoroughly vetted before you give them access to the device or the data on the device. Moving on to the companion phone or the mobile application itself, we have multiple applications running on the companion phone that constantly interact with the wearable. This could be to extract data or to keep updating the profile information on the wearable device itself. And a lot of data is being exchanged back and forth. Now, to pick a few requirements or to name some of the requirements you need to incorporate while designing the mobile component of the wearable ecosystem, let me pick the mobile app, multiple app and device communication. So as I said, multiple applications are constantly communicating with the wearable. all the data needs to be isolated. So, for instance, if you look at a smart home ecosystem or smart eyewear, most of these devices are shared by multiple users, right? I mean, you could have a wearable glass that could be used by different people in your family, but you do not want the data to be mixed. You want the application data and also the user data to be isolated from one another. And the other important requirement that is overseen by a lot of OEMs and a lot of vendors is the privacy opt-in, opt-out feature. What this means is any data that is collected by the wearable or the mobile application needs to be clearly disclosed to the user. And if the user wants to opt out of giving away any of this information, they need to have a choice to do so from the mobile application. And the user should also have an option to delete any of the previously collected data. And this could be from the past year, from the past month, or anything of that sort, but the user needs to have the flexibility to choose what is being collected. Now, speaking of the cloud component itself, apart from incorporating the standard web application best practices, the OWASP web application concepts, we also need to pay attention to securing the infrastructure itself, hardening the infrastructure. To give an example, you might do a great job securing your entire web app interface, your user portal, your admin portals, and all of that. But if you do or if you commit a very minor mistake of wrongly configuring the security groups, you might risk exposing all your cloud interfaces or cloud instances to the world. So, for instance, your Amazon S3 bucket or your databases you might be intending to make them accessible to only the people in your organization, but if you misconfigure the security groups, you could probably expose all these interfaces to the world. And also encrypting the user data and storing user data at rest is also tricky on the cloud interface, because as an OEM or as a vendor, you do not want this data to be accessible to even people in your organization. Only the data owner or the user who owns this data should be able to access and decrypt this information that is encrypted and stored in the cloud backend. Now that we saw the different security requirements that apply to each component in the wearable ecosystem, let's take a look at how these work together. When these different components interact and interoperate with each other, they open up a set of newer security vulnerabilities. Old security vulnerabilities actually manifest in a different and darker ways when these components interact with each other. We have a few examples of what this means, and we would like to also describe this as the butterfly effect, which basically means a vulnerability in a single component of the ecosystem could lead to the compromise of the entire ecosystem or even the entire user base, and also have like a ripple effect throughout the ecosystem. Now, we have a couple of cool demos here for you. The first one, let me give you an overview of the ecosystem itself. We have a wearable which communicates with a companion application over Bluetooth and BLE. And it also has the capability to connect with external sensors here on the left. And the companion application itself can communicate with the cloud backend. When we look at the communication between the wearable and the mobile application, it primarily consists of two different types. One, the device commands or the information that is exchanged or that flows from the companion application to the wearable device. So it could be commands like reset or factory reset, reboot that are issued by the wearable, by the companion application to the wearable. And also you have social notifications like WhatsApp, Facebook, and you also have the capability to answer calls or reply back to text from the wearable itself. And the second category of information that flows from the wearable back to the companion application is user data, user profile information, and also ability to control applications, so pause music track and so on. Now, if you're looking at this entire data that is going back and forth between the wearable and the companion application, and if you're looking at this from an attacker's perspective, right, from an external point of view, Bluetooth offers link layer encryption. So if you're trying to sniff this data using tools like Ubertooth or such, and if you try to analyze this traffic, it's all encrypted. So all you would see is garbage. But what about the applications that live on the mobile phone itself? Can they access this information? So it turns out that an application living on the mobile phone can indeed access this encrypted information. So although you turn on Bluetooth link layer encryption, an application living on the same companion application can still access this information. And the reason for that being, all the applications can subscribe to the Bluetooth service and get data on the same Bluetooth channels as the legitimate application. What this means is the Bluetooth channel between the wearable device and the companion app is shared between all the applications that run on the mobile app. And the screenshot you see here is from the actual developer documentation, and it says that all you need to access any data exchange on a Bluetooth channel is the Bluetooth and Bluetooth admin permissions. You just have to define it in your manifest, and then you'll have access to all the data exchange over Bluetooth channel. And the other abilities granted by this permission should not be used. It just says it, but there are no actual rules in place to prevent any malicious application trying to access this information that is being shared on a Bluetooth channel. And we have a demo to walk through what this means. The first class of wearables, they use Bluetooth, and it's proprietary code. We didn't have access to the source code for this class of wearables, but we were able to do some market research to kind of identify the headers and then figure out the message format that is being used to exchange data. And so we have the legitimate application running in the background, and the wearable is going through some activity. The user is putting the wearable through some activity, and there are steps and calories, everything that are being counted. So initially, when we, let me pause, the application on the right is the malware application. Now, what we did was when we tried to sniff the data and then look at the data that was being exchanged, initially it was all random bits and bytes. We didn't really understand what was being exchanged. And then on the left is the ADB log. So what we did was we wrote a tiny script to kind of change or interpret what is being recorded. And then soon we noticed that it was indeed the steps, calorie, and the heart rate information that was actually supposed to be available to the legit application. So we kept spinning the wearable. We just simulated some activity. And then you can see that, you can see that all the data that is actually accessible to the legit application can be captured by the malware application, and you can actually see it in here. And all we had to do was to just write a tiny script. We have a second class of, the second category of wearables that we assessed was slightly more complex. They operate over Bluetooth and BLE too, but this time when we tried to issue commands, rather than read the data of the wearable. So what we tried was we tried to send commands like factory reset, reboot, firmware update from the malicious application or the malware application, but they were being rejected. So we took a step back to see what was going on, and it turns out that the legit application did indeed have some kind of authentication to connect to the wearable, but this did not stop us. The the legitimate application was authenticating the communication channel. Initially, the first connection that was established was being authenticated, but the messages that were exchanged later on were not being authenticated. So partial security is not sufficient. Let me quickly show you a demo for it. This is the legitimate application on the left over there, and then it's scanning for the wearable and connecting to the wearable. And on the in the background, you have the Minicom interface just to see the logs. And these are the reboot, power down, factory reset commands that are supported by the legit application. Now we are issuing a reboot command, and you can see in the Minicom interface that the device actually goes through a reboot when you issue that command. Now we are firing up the malware application, which, we just try to create a custom malware application based on the reverse engineer. We just reverse engineered the legitimate app and then created a malware application. And now we issue a reboot after the legit app sends out a command. So what we did was we waited for the legitimate application to establish the connection because that initial message was being authenticated. But the malware application piggybacks behind the legitimate application and sends a reboot command. So here, the malware application is waiting for the legit app to establish an authenticated channel, and then we initiate a reboot. So here, you'll actually see that the wearable is being rebooted. So partial security is not sufficient. Every message and every command that goes from the phone or the mobile companion application to the wearable needs to be authenticated. The second demo we have here is protecting user data that is stored in the logs. The wearable ecosystem is something similar to the in-ear fitness coach that we saw earlier. This is a smart wearable which helps the user coach for an event. So you can ask, and the coach is basically an interactive module that wakes up on a key command. So you can say things like Alexa or Siri, Google. So it wakes up on a keyword, and you can ask questions like, train me for a marathon, train me for a 4K run or 5K run, so on. And the coach constantly interacts with the user, and the dialogue between the user and the coach is recorded. So that is what coach commentary is. And we also have language definitions and dialogue definitions, which are used to support interaction in multiple languages and also to interpret different keywords. So now that I told you what coach commentary is, any guesses as to what could have gone wrong in this particular demo or particular use case? Sorry? That's one of the possibilities, yeah. Okay, so the problem was the coach commentary, language definitions, and dialogue definitions were all being stored in plain text. And these were being represented as FIT and JSON files. And if you're familiar with the FIT files, they're actually a format that is used to represent GPS coordinates, latitude and longitude, and also basically your entire route information. So if you get access to a FIT file, you can actually see where the user started their run from and ended their run, where the user was at a particular time. And also, if you are used to just biking from your home to work every day, you can actually notice the pattern of the user if you get access to the FIT file. And due to the private storage limitations, what we noticed was not only were these files stored as plain text, but they're also stored in public storage. And they obviously contain a lot of personally identifiable information and also a lot of intellectual property. An attacker could obviously tamper this data. They could try and replace these files with, some kind of, you could just remove the contents in the file, and then it doesn't need to be like an advanced attack. It could just be tampering the contents, and also you could use these files for code execution. And since these are stored in public storage, these FIT and JSON files are also accessible to other malicious applications on the mobile phone itself. And our recommendation to prevent problems like this is avoid public storage whenever possible, and support for encryption. If you store, if you have to use public storage for whatever reason, in our particular case, the storage, the coach commentary was really huge, and there were private storage restrictions. So if at all you need to use public storage for whatever reason, do encrypt it. Do make sure that the dialog files and any sensitive information is signed, so that an attacker, so you prevent any tampering of the file itself. And also, like I mentioned earlier, capability for the user to delete this information. If the user doesn't want to record any of this dialogue exchange, they need to be able to delete this information from the app and from the cloud too. The third example we have is really cool. This is actually one of my favorite. This is a classic example of the butterfly effect that I had mentioned earlier, where a problem in one particular component resulted in the compromise of the entire ecosystem. So the use case we have here is pretty similar. We have the wearable communicating with the mobile app over Bluetooth and BLE, and also the cloud portal. The cloud portal has different features. So some of the primary ones being support for login and sign up for the user, and also support for connecting with friends, where you can find other people who are using the wearable by searching either with their first and last name or email ID, and then you can add them as friends, and then you can watch their activity, comment on their activity, and so on. And also there is support for admin portal. So the cloud component has two different portals, one for the user, where the user can control and manage their own activity. But there's also an admin portal in parallel, where the admin of the organization or of the entire ecosystem can control and view different devices in the field. So if your device gets stolen or something like that, you can reach out to the admin group, and then you can request for a remote lockdown or data wipe. So our target pages were these. These are screenshots of the user portal itself. On the user sign-up page, you have the first and last name fields. So the highlighted portions were our target fields. And the right snippet is what you would see after you log in. So you can edit your first and last name and all of that even after you register. So what we exploited was a very age-old cross-site scripting vulnerability, right? It's been there for many years now. So all we did was we just exploited a cross-site scripting vulnerability in these first and last name fields. So the exploit scenario is as follows. The attacker uses the friend request functionality on the user portal. As I mentioned earlier, the cloud portal offers support for users to look up people and then send them friend requests. And the other party, once they approve the friend request, you can view their activity and all of that. But for our particular exploit, the victim doesn't have to accept the invite. They don't even have to take any action. That is the beauty of this attack. And the attacker exploits a classic cross-site scripting vulnerability in the user portal or the sign-up pages. And the other feature that we made use of is at once the portal can show up to 5 friend requests. So the reason we made use of this feature was the first and last name fields had a restriction of 30 character limit. So we had to use 2 different friend requests to launch the exploit code, hence giving us more space to have our exploit code. And similarly, you can use up to 5 friend requests. And the example characters we have here is everybody's favorite. The first attacker, or the first user that we use as an attacker, is Arya. And she defines the variable. You can see the script on the left. And then also the second attacker needs to use the variable. So whatever Arya defines gets used by Jon Snow. And the victim here is Cersei. So they just send her a request, a friend request with crafted exploit code. And the friend requests are in the same order. Now, Cersei just needs to log in. She doesn't have to view the friend request, but she has requests from Arya and Jon Snow waiting. So she doesn't have to accept the friend request. She doesn't even have to view the request she has. So as soon as she logs in, our exploit code gets executed, and the cookies and basically everything is logged at the attacker's end. And in a normal scenario, it would just compromise Cersei's user account. But in this particular scenario, since we also have the admin portal, the attacker gets a little more clever and then uses this attack to steal the admin credentials. So what happens here is, since the cloud supports remote device management, the stolen admin credentials could be used to actually lock down all the devices in the field. So anybody who owns this data, or the wearable, they can be completely logged out of their wearable. And also, the stolen credentials could be used to initiate a complete remote wipe of all the wearables in the field. Now, that's a lot of unauthorized access to user data, a lot of PII data, and also unintended access to user accounts. And also, if there is a way to roll out firmware updates through the cloud portal, an attacker could use this attack to exploit that feature. And yeah, a lot of security and privacy violations here. Thank you. Sumanth will walk over the privacy aspect of.
Thanks. So think about that last example that Kavya just talked about. Right? So the root cause for that vulnerability was, go back. The root cause of the vulnerability was a cross-site scripting. Cross-site scripting attacks have been out for like 20, 30 years now, but we're talking about a cross-site scripting in a cloud ecosystem, in a web application, trickling down all the way to the wearable devices, which have nothing to do with cross-site scripting. There's hardly even any JavaScript code on that. Right, so that's the butterfly effect that we're talking about. How now a vulnerability in one component can really spread across and affect multiple components that are part of the wearable or the IoT. The fun world of privacy. So IoT and wearable devices live in close proximity to humans. So they either live on your body, like a fitness tracker, activity monitor, or they live around you, like a baby monitor, or inside of you, like a pacemaker, which means they have access to a whole lot of privacy-related information, sensitive, PII, and so on. But the challenge that we are seeing when it comes to manufacturers of these class of products is defining what is PII. It becomes very subjective. So it depends on what you're making, what kind of data you collect, what do you do with the data. Because for one company, maybe the name and email address is not very sensitive, but for someone else, it may be. My Gmail address is fairly public. I don't care if someone finds out my Gmail address. But we've seen some examples of, let's say, like questionable services like the Ashley Madison Adult Friend Finder Network, where there was information leak belonging to, about the users' names and email addresses. There was a big deal made out of the whole of the whole breach, that there were some email addresses ending in .mil.gov. So in this case, you see that there is just the name and email address can be very, very sensitive depending on the kind of services your company offers. So defining what is PII, your ethnicity, your race, your height, weight, your heart rate information, all these could be PII. And then there's the challenge of data management. So like I said, IoT and wearable devices collect a lot of data. The question then is, who owns this data? Who's the processor of the data? Who manages this data? Right, so in this world where these devices collect a lot of information and it's a big deal, and we have companies that actually share this data with third parties to provide value-add services. Now the question comes of whose privacy guidelines come into effect? Is it the data owners or the data processors? How do these things work together? Right? If the third party that gets access to your data does not provide adequate security for that particular piece of information, then are you responsible or is the third party responsible? Facebook, Cambridge Analytica. But it's real, right? So you have almost all of these manufacturers and product makers sharing data to provide those rich set of graphs for generating the Tableau kind of information to enable those use cases. And people love it. That's what they want. There's also the challenge of data retention and deletion. Let's say one of my users decides to exit the program. What are the policies for deleting that particular user's information? Do I just delete the data from the main stack, the production stack? Do I also delete from my backups? Do I need to retain them for 2 years, for 3 years, for legal and compliance reasons? So these are some of the questions that companies need to answer when they're dealing with third-party data. And then there's the regulatory guidelines and the privacy laws. So each country has its own set of guidelines. The US, Europe, Russia, China have their own diverse set of privacy laws that are oftentimes conflicting. The General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, is interesting. We're just about 2 months away from that. It focuses a lot on securing the data and protecting the rights of the users. So which means that if you are a wearable device manufacturer or an IoT device manufacturer located somewhere else but selling your product in Europe, you still need to comply with GDPR. If your users are citizens of EU but living in, let's say, the US or China, you still need to comply with GDPR. So, which is great, but this puts a lot of emphasis and responsibility for the device manufacturers. And this is really interesting because many of the IoT manufacturers, the wearable manufacturers, are small firms. They are small, medium-sized businesses. They are startups that never really had to think about security and regulatory guidelines, but now they have to. They never really thought about things like secure boot, device security, how to do security for like small form factor devices, but now they have to, which is a good thing. And this also governs what these kind of companies need to do when there is a data breach, how to handle disclosures. If there is a breach of your user data, whether you need to go public with it, how do you handle like your PR, how do you comply with the company, the country privacy laws and so on. And privacy breaches are not just theoretical, so these are actually happening. So these are some of the headlines that you see about breaches to user data that have happened over the past couple of years. In fact, the top 2 headlines that you see have happened this year. We are barely 3 months into it. So VTech is a smart IoT toy manufacturer that had an issue with handling data belonging to children. This becomes really tricky and really sensitive because handling information belonging to minors is taken very, very seriously in most countries. And honestly, the $650K fine, the penalty is peanuts. But we are going to see more and more cases like this. And the Strava fitness app issue is pretty interesting. This was a case where you have Strava, which allows services with third-party fitness trackers. Right? So it has a layer of abstraction there. So the privacy enforcement can get tricky. So you have the privacy policies of Strava now working in conjunction with, let's say, the privacy policies of your fitness tracker. So you need to intersect that and see what kind of privacy policies come into effect. But that doesn't matter, right? So ultimately, the headline is all about Strava apps leaking information about military locations. So that's the end. Quantifying is something that that our research team is also looking into. So security vulnerabilities and tracking and scoring them has been in existence for a long time. Most of you are familiar with the CVSS framework, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. It's a great framework. It allows security teams to have a simple 1 to 10 or a 0 to 10 score and grade your security bug as a low or a critical. So when you go to your management and you say that you have a CVSS 9 bug, they're going to say, okay, stop ship, we need to fix this before this product goes out. But given the increasing number of breaches when it comes to privacy, we had the Facebook issue, we had the Uber hack, had the Equifax hack last year, millions of people affected. So one of the topics that we are looking into is to see if we can actually quantify privacy vulnerabilities. So what does it mean when there is a breach? What kind of action should we take as a company to handle a particular privacy breach? So to sum up, what we are proposing here is that STL is great. We want to reuse as much as possible from the standard security development lifecycle, but we need to rethink STL when we are doing it for IoT and wearable devices. The cliched shift left becomes really critical. So IoT and wearable devices have a rapid time to market. We have the requirements constantly evolving. The designs keep changing. And it is definitely true, especially given the problems with updating these devices in the field, the longevity of these devices, that the sooner you find these bugs in the architecture stage, in the threat modeling stage, in the code review stage, it saves a lot of money for the product teams. And it is necessary to be much more agile. You can no longer rely on the traditional waterfall STL process. And we need to pay attention to the specific architecture of the IoT and the wearable product. So it is hard to apply a generic template or generic formula for doing security for STL, for our IoT devices, because we have all vulnerabilities manifesting in different ways. So think about the ecosystem. Don't just look at the ingredient level security. So think about the protocols. There are hundreds of protocols. We're talking about new ones coming almost every day. So how do you do security for these protocols that are constantly evolving and that people are not using as a standard? How do you integrate these devices and the software with third-party code that you have no control about? What happens if there is a vulnerability in the third-party code, and how does that affect your IoT product? And the interoperability. Remember the cloud, the mobile app, and the device. So how do these things work together, and how do you do security as a whole? And the data and the privacy as always. So that sums it up. And yeah, we are here for Q&A. Any questions? Yes.
Hi, Simon Sherrill, reporter for the Register. I'm just wondering, do you think that any of the principles you're applying to your development lifecycle could also be used in other IoT scenarios? Because, as you described, a smartphone doing some initial data processing is almost identical to what an IoT gateway is proposed to do.
Yes, so the question, again, if I understood correctly, is can we have our security development lifecycle apply generically to IoT platforms in general, not just like where the smartphones are involved? The answer is yes. What we want to propose here is more of it's things to think about when you're developing an IoT product, right? So I want to stress that there is no one fixed formula. It's not like if you follow our STL process, you can apply it directly to every platform. So the product that the case study that we looked at was a wearable device, but you could have an IoT product which is an HVAC device that monitors your air conditioning and heating, but that might be using a companion phone application for completely different reasons, right? So you could be using your phone app for, let's say, provisioning the device in the field, but then you no longer use it. You're going to use the IoT device directly talking to the cloud, exchanging data over the standard TCP/IP stack. But the critical thing here is that, remember the three paradigms the three main domain paradigms that we spoke about, the hardware security, the software security, and the cloud security. All that will be applicable in this case, because pretty much this is the blueprint that you see that most IoT device manufacturers use. So they have a cloud component, a backend, they have the devices, which is the actual IoT devices, and that interacts with the backend and provides all the services. So short answer, yes, but what we would say is that you need to tailor this to your product. Anyone else? All right, if not, we are going to be around, so feel free to come by and chat with us. Thank you very much.